our brain is constantly weighing one potential reward or threat relief against another. And the simple example I always use is a gazelle could go out to greener pasture and get more dopamine, or it could stick with the herd and get more oxytocin. It's actually deciding that with every single step. But sometimes we just want to be objective and we want to say, well, what really is my safest option in each minute? And yet there is no perfect objectivity because, again, our old pathways are such a big factor in how we weigh the alternatives.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. As professor of management at California State University and the author of Habits of a Happy Brain, Dr. Loretta Breuning found herself questioning prevailing theories of human motivation. As she began studying mammalian social behavior, she discovered that our brain chemicals swing up and down because they have evolved to do a job. But most of us don't know it's happening and can't identify what that job is. Loretta uncovered that each happy brain chemical has evolved to motivate a specific survival behavior, and that these pathways are burning strong in each of our brains today. By learning how these chemicals work, she now teaches others how to rewire their instinctive thinking to create better outcomes both at work and at home. In this episode, Dr. Loretta Breuning and I talk about the 4 brain chemicals, their origin and purpose, and how they affect our experience of work. We also talk about identifying and understanding emotional responses, how to hack brain patterns to create more positive outcomes, using psychological techniques to create more happiness at work, as well as other parts of our lives, and other topics. If you enjoy Work for Humans, remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Loretta Breuning. Welcome, Loretta Breuning, to Work for Humans.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
I've spent the last days really deeply studying your work. And if I was going to summarize your work, I would say it's about how we have the ability to control or to train how our minds work. So one of your central books is The Habits of the Happy Brain. So Habits of a Happy Brain. And it's about how our brain chemicals affect our experience, what's the origin of the patterns of those effects, and how we can create new patterns. Is that a good summary of your work?
Perfect. Yes, exactly.
First, what I want to do is I do want to get into what are those core chemicals. This relates to a couple of other episodes that we've had. It relates a little bit to a book called Alive at Work, which was by Dan Cable, primarily talking about dopamine, I believe. It was about this, he called it the seeking system. It relates somewhat to an episode with Shalini Verma in which she talked about trauma-informed management. And so I may refer back to those, but you've gone much more deeply into the specific chemicals that affect, should I say chemicals or should I say hormones? Should I say endocrine system? What do you call them?
I call them chemicals because that's a general term, whereas hormones only applies to the ones that can cross the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't include neurotransmitters. So that's why I just say chemicals.
Okay, great. And you usually say brain chemicals, which makes a lot of sense. And ultimately where I want to go with this conversation is I want to end up talking about how we might use what you are teaching to design better work. So first of all, let's dive into what are the major brain chemicals and what does each of them do for us?
Sure. So when you say the brain chemicals, I focus on the happy brain chemicals. So I focus on dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin. And each of these creates a good feeling, but they're very different, distinct good feeling. And they're designed to motivate us to take action to meet a survival need. And each one of them motivates different action to meet different survival needs. And that's why we're motivated to have all of them and we want all of them. But it's also why we don't have all of them all the time because they're not designed to be always on. They're designed to be released in short spurts in a situation when it actually promotes your survival to take this action.
Do we have pretty good words to describe the feeling that each of them gives us? So, for instance, dopamine. How would you characterize the effects of dopamine?
So I call it the excitement of anticipating a reward that meets a need. So a reward is just anything that meets a need, but it's anything that met a need in your past. So you have a neural circuit that anticipates that it will meet a need again, even though you could say, well, does pizza really need a need? And it's the excitement of anticipating a reward because in the state of nature, it releases the energy that gets a body to move toward the resource that meets the need. And that energy is the feeling of excitement, sort of like when you see a person playing a video game, they're going toward a reward and they seem all revved up.
And so it's anticipation, but it's positive anticipation. It's this sense of, oh, there's something good over there. And the purpose of dopamine in this particular case is to get us to go over there, basically. And this is going to be true for each of these, but is it learned what the over there that's good is?
Exactly. But it's not learned in a conscious way, it's learned from lived experience. So, in a metaphorical way, I say that the dopamine is like paving on the neural pathway that whatever triggered it in your past connected neurons that tell you, oh, this is it. This is what's going to turn it on. And that's why, from a monkey perspective, which is how I discovered all of this, that helps a monkey find the food that satisfied its hunger in the past. But from a human perspective, that's why we get excited about very different things because it's wired by our past.
And how about oxytocin? How is it different from dopamine?
Oxytocin, from an animal perspective, is the good feeling of letting down your guard. We like to let down our guard, but on the other hand, from an animal perspective, you could see why it wouldn't promote survival to let it down in the wrong circumstances. So our brain is designed to look around and take in information and make careful decisions and say, okay, now it's safe. So how do you know it's safe? The classic mammalian situation is that you have protection from others and you feel that you could trust those others to protect you. And that's an inherently selfish desire. It's like, I want you to protect me. And yet, oxytocin has been sort of glorified as this altruistic thing, which is part of why people find it hard to understand.
Would we generally find this associated with feelings of belonging?
Yes, belonging, but again, belonging points to that subjective feeling that I belong and therefore I expect that you guys are going to protect me. And then if I feel unsafe and unprotected, then instead of knowing that I created that feeling, I'm going to blame you for not letting me belong.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember Steven Pinker in How the Mind Works. He wrote about the 11 primal fears of humans, and one of them is going out alone. It's something that can be very scary. It can be the basis of a phobia, the fear of not being inside the group and protected.
Yeah, well, a good deal of it is learned. But from an animal perspective, if you are eating grass and you're alone, then you're so busy looking for predators that you can't enjoy the grass. And then when you're in the middle of the herd, then you're protected, but then you're eating grass that has been peed on by like hundreds of others. So it's an uncomfortable trade off. And the animal brain is designed to make that uncomfortable trade off.
And I know you focus largely on mammals, but I've seen this in schooling fish, which is that I go diving and spearfishing and I'm swimming in a school of anchovies. Well, if there's predators at the edge, everybody wants to be on the inside of the school. And when there are no predators, then they're willing to spread out because they can find more food that way.
Exactly. Very good. And once again, this is represented as an altruistic behavior. But in fact, each individual is pushing toward the center with all of its strength. So it's not sacrificing itself for the group at all. It's using the group to try to promote its own survival.
Do we see mammals establishing that kind of tribalism, I'm going to say, that kind of collective, by establishing that there's an other, that there's some non-tribe that I'm going to set myself off against?
Yes, exactly. The common enemy is what keeps the group together. And exactly what you said, that when the fish would prefer to spread out when there's no predator, and yet when there's a predator, they cluster. And baboons are a fascinating example of this because they're one of the few species that will attack back against a lion. And when they stick together, they could do this. But when there's no predator, they prefer to spread out because it's easier to get food that way.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got dopamine, which I'm going to refer to as anticipation of something, probably a learned thing that's good. We've got oxytocin, which is social support and social grouping. And then we've got serotonin.
The interesting thing, you asked me if there's one word that describes each of them. And because serotonin is so dicey and socially unacceptable, I generated a list of like 2 or 3 dozen synonyms for it. But the simple word I would use is pride or self confidence. But more directly, it's a sense of social importance.
That's funny because I didn't have any negative association with serotonin. I didn't know. I didn't know that was that one's on the outs.
Oh, well, so because it's the natural urge for status or the one up feeling. So most people will insist that they don't care about status and they don't care, they don't enjoy being in the one up position. Other people may do that, but I'm too enlightened to want to be in the one up position and get pleasure from that. So it takes a little bit of effort to get people to see that this is actually a very strong desire and a very powerful, good feeling.
Very interesting. Serotonin is the feeling of being one up, but social anxiety seems like it's associated with the opposite. And elsewhere, you talk about cortisol. So let's talk about cortisol, and then I want to talk about its relationship to the other aspects. How would you characterize cortisol?
A simple way to think of it is it's nature's emergency broadcast system, and its job is to make you feel like you're going to die if you don't act fast to do whatever it takes to make it stop. So, in the state of nature, this would motivate a gazelle to run from a predator when it would really rather keep eating. But in the modern world, we don't have a lot of predators, and yet we still have this nature's emergency alert system. And like all the other chemicals, it's like paving on your neural pathways. So whatever triggered your cortisol in your past built pathways that turn it on for you today. And the cortisol pathways get your attention really powerfully. That's the way they're designed to work because, like a gazelle that ignored its cortisol alarm, would be weeded out of the gene pool. So cortisol is very good at getting your attention.
And so it seems like these would be related to each other. Like, let's take serotonin. Serotonin is what I feel when I'm one up, when I have status. But there's potentially cortisol when I feel a status threat. And I can imagine that it might be the same also for oxytocin, which is that when I feel like I'm surrounded by a group of people who are supportive of me and protective of me and I feel safe, great. But if I find myself outside of that group, being pushed out, then I might have the sense of cortisol.
Yes, exactly. But because it's wired from past experience, you can anticipate threats that are not actually there. So you can fear losing the group, being kicked out of the group. And of course, with the cancel culture today, it's a realistic fear. People are always kicking each other out of the group. Now, with serotonin, let's say that you're the eighth richest billionaire in the world, that you could fear that like 2 more billionaires are going to come along and kick you off the list, and you're no longer going to be one of the 10 richest billionaires in the world. So everyone can create this fear of losing whatever one up position is meaningful to them and trigger their own cortisol with their own thoughts.
And so when we speak about being triggered, is it often one of these old patterns?
Yes, but a pattern is a real physical pathway in your brain. And the reason we use old pathways is that the electricity in your brain flows very easily into pathways that are already connected and myelinated from early experience. And it's very hard to get the electricity in your brain to flow into an undeveloped neural pathway. So this is why we all repeat ourselves And we repeat patterns that we experienced when we were young without conscious intent and without even conscious memory of the original experience.
As I think about this, I see it as being useful in two different ways. One way, which we're going to talk about first, is it's something that I can use to understand my own emotions. And it's something I can use to potentially improve my responses to different situations. And that's a lot of what your work has been about. And then I see this other part that I want to get into second, which is, can we use it to design a better experience of work, for instance? Can we recognize what these things are? So let's go to the first one first, which is this something that I can use, or somebody can use this understanding of these different brain chemicals used to change my responses to stimulus?
Yes, but. So I think the but is that self acceptance is more important than change because we can make change around the margins, but we're always going to have this core mammalian operating system. And if we think that we're going to reject it or ignore it, it's not going to happen. So we're better off learning to understand it, to accept it in ourselves, and to accept it in others. And I think about it as like a horse and rider situation where the horse is the mammalian brain that controls our chemicals. The rider is the human cortex, which has verbal abstraction capacity, but does not control our physiology. So the two brains have to work together. And if the rider gets this idea that it's too important to care about what the horse thinks, that it's not going to work out.
Can you describe an example of somebody learning to do that?
So let's take a simple example of if you're in a meeting at work and you walk out of the meeting and you just have this really bad feeling after the meeting and it just whooshes into you, and this happened to me, it's fascinating. Like, I think it happens to us in different ways for different reasons. So if I say, okay, I have created this bad feeling, as much as I would like to blame you guys in the meeting for my feeling, to say, okay, what is the pattern in this feeling that I have? And how does it match the pattern of bad feelings that I had when I was young? And then I look at bad feelings that I was young and I say, oh my God, it's obviously like the exact same pattern I could see. Then I say, okay, what would I like my alternative response to be? Well, first is the self acceptance that I don't have to say that I'm an idiot. I'm just a natural mammal that is wired from my early experience and using the neural pathways that I have. I can build a new pathway, it takes a lot of work, a lot of repetition. So first I have to design it. So I could say, what alternative feeling would I like to have? What alternative thought, pattern, belief that I would like to have when I walk out of a meeting? So a simple, obvious example would be to say that my survival does not depend on the immediate feedback that I got in response to whatever transpired at the meeting. Okay. And even to make it more positive than that is to say, I'm happy with the comments I made, and I trust that other people will process them in time. That would just be an example, but everyone can customize it to what their own patterns are. So then, how do I repeat this pattern so that I make it my new neural pathway? Well, at first it sounds false and not believable, and your old pattern turns on your chemistry so fast, you don't even know that you chose that. So the simple example is the way dog training works is to literally give yourself a treat for embracing the new pattern. So the treat could be a cookie if you want, just in the interest of time to make it simple. Or I say, let's say it's listening to comedy on my phone for 5 minutes. So I'm going to get out of this meeting. I'm going to spend 60 seconds having a positive pattern that I'm going to construct that has positive anticipation about the outcome of that meeting. And then I'm going to give myself a treat. And then the positive feeling of the treat will connect with the neural pathway of my new view, and it will link it to my happy chemicals, and it will build the neural pathway if I keep repeating that.
And I'll tell you where this plays into some of the things that we've been discussing on the show. One place it plays in is that one of the guests on the show was Joe Pine, who talked about the experience economy and how economies move from goods through products, through services to experiences and then transformations to the transformation economy. And we realized that an awful lot of what people say they want from work is in the experience economy. Well, the thing about the experience economy and the transformation economy is that they are highly co-created, especially the transformation economy, which is that if I want to earn a graduate degree, which is a part of the transformation economy, I'm going to have to work a lot to get there. Or if I want to go to the gym and I'm going to have to work a lot to get there. And so, first of all, the experience economy, as it interacts with your work, would be saying, look, there are these patterns that people have learned that they want certain things out of work. One person's dopamine is not going to be somebody else's dopamine, the cause, right? And there's an enormous range of things that are going to cause different people to experience the feelings associated with dopamine. And I've probably found about 15 so far of these things, 15 to 30 things that really people say they want from work. One of them is status. So that's not dopamine. That's going to be
Serotonin.
That's going to be serotonin. Some of them just want puzzles to solve, closer to dopamine. And some of them are responding to the fear of cortisol. There are things that they're negative things they don't want from work, which I almost never interview people about. I don't interview people about all the bad things about work. And I think that might be a problem. I mean, maybe that's something that we need to get deeper into.
Mm-hmm.
But it also means that in the co-creation of work experience, people might want to tinker with the pathways that are causing them to feel different ways about work. So, do you find that people use your techniques to deal with work or to deal with family, to deal with all sorts of things, but do you find them using your techniques to deal with work?
Yes, absolutely. And I think where you were going with that was that it's an uncomfortable trade off because we want a variety of different things from life. So, partly people want more resources, partly they want more free time, partly they want a sense of creativity, and partly they want a sense of social recognition. So, if you have any one job that gives you a certain amount of that, then you think, well, some other job might give me more of this, but less of that. So our brain is designed to predict rewards, but we can't predict them perfectly. Our brain is also designed to focus on the unmet need. So if my job gives me more of this and less of that, then instead of appreciating what it already gives me, I get all frustrated about the thing it doesn't give me. And then I dream that in this other job, I would have a perfect situation on that component, forgetting that then I would pay a price in some other. So it's the trade offs, which is the last chapter of my book, which is the uncomfortable part. And what you refer to as co creating would be ideal if the employee and the employer could develop realistic expectations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, one of the patterns that I've written about is called the change of pace. It does not matter how great anything is. If you do it for too long, you're going to want something else.
Absolutely.
It's one of the things that you spoke of in your writing that was really interesting to me is that most of these brain chemicals are very short-lived. They're short-lived and they're responsive to the environment in the sense that if you have two consistently, they only recognize difference, right? And so there's the hedonic treadmill, which says that I need to constantly reach for something new. And that would argue that that's really the source of the hedonic treadmill is short-lived brain chemicals that stop responding to the same stimulus.
Yes, it's called habituation. And this is a natural, normal thing. The reason we have to really emphasize that is so many, let's say, people with a spiritual tradition would say that this hedonic treadmill is wrong and you shouldn't think that way. But it's really a physiological thing. And the example I use is if I walk into a flower shop and I say, oh my God, this smell makes me feel so good. I'm going to just quit my job and work here forever. But every day when you arrive at this flower shop, after about 10 minutes, you're going to stop smelling it. And I actually interviewed someone. There's a hot chocolate shop in London, and it just smells so good. And all they serve is chocolate and hot chocolate. And I asked her, how long does she smell it? So, yeah, she said about an hour, but I think, yeah, she was even overgeneralizing.
And you also might start to associate the smell of hot chocolate with that job, at which point you're like, I don't ever want to do that again. No more hot chocolate.
That I have to say, when I was young, I actually was a waitress at a restaurant that served hot fudge. So I could just help myself to it whenever I wanted. And I did lose my taste for it, I have to admit.
Kids are so incredibly emotionally volatile. Like the number of times a 3-year-old cries in a day or laughs delightedly in a day or one of those things. Is brain development early on just flooded with these different brain chemicals? Are there differences in the young?
Sure. But the simple way of saying it is that we're born with billions of neurons, but very few connections between them. So we can't really make sense of the world because it's the connections, the organization of the neurons that gives meaning to things. Now, a baby is born with the capacity to feel hunger, but not with the knowledge of what's necessary to relieve the hunger. So, slowly over time, you used a 3-year-old, slowly over time, you get more connections, but the connections are literally paved by the chemicals. So, whatever turn on your bad feelings in the past, you turn them on faster. Whatever turn on good feelings in your past, that the circuits turn them on faster. But the bottom line is that crying, when you mention crying, crying is rewarded in children. It's very hard to resist. I have grandchildren now. It's very hard to resist rewarding a crying child. So I think that's a big part of the dynamic.
This really puts a real challenge in front of parents, doesn't it?
Oh,
It
yeah.
means that you're curating the neural pathways of rewards that are going to ultimately form your child's adult emotional landscape.
Exactly. Exactly. And that sounds ominous.
It does, yeah.
So the best we could say is that we are all in the same boat, having this mammalian operating system that, like what I always say, like about serotonin, everyone wants to be special. Every mammal has this natural urge to be special. And yet we all have to share the world with 8 billion other people that want to be special as much as we do. So when you're 3 years old, you want to be the most special kid in preschool and you want to be the most special kid at home. And then you're slowly, gradually having to deal with that. You can't be the most special kid every minute of every day.
Yeah, that's one of probably a dozen different dynamics that are in play.
Impossible dilemmas for parents. Yeah.
I've kind of said this already, but it's a slightly different question, which is, do these different chemicals fight with each other? And I'll give you a concrete example of this, which is I spearfish at night. And of Steven Pinker's 11 things people have naturally the ability to develop phobias to, it touches on 4 or 5 of them. So fear of going out alone, fear of the dark, fear of deep water, fear of large carnivores. All of these things are at play, but there's a dopamine thing, which is I might get a big fish. And so when I'm in shallow water, my brain is really dominated by I might get a big fish. And I swim out along this pier, and the pier has pilings. And each further piling I go out into deep water, the imaginary big fish I might catch starts to be replaced by an imaginary large carnivore that might eat me. And so on different nights, I can go farther out on those pilings before the terror is just too much and I have to turn around. So I can feel my brain modeling, and I can feel one model coming to overtake another. So what that means to me is that there's an interplay between these that might be the source of approach avoidance, for instance, that people have. So is there an interplay?
Absolutely. All the time. Our brain is constantly weighing one potential reward or threat relief against another. And the simple example I always use is a gazelle could go out to greener pasture and get more dopamine, or it could stick with the herd and get more oxytocin. And so it's actually deciding that with every single step. Should I take my next step closer toward the herd to feel safe, or should I take it closer to the greener pasture? And it's always judging the distance of how far it is with the herd. So when I feel frustrated, I say, okay, well, every gazelle is making this decision in every minute. So my brain is designed to make that decision too. But what you mentioned about your fishing, so it reminds me of what Roy Baumeister calls ego depletion. So when you're out there fishing, you prefer to focus on the reward rather than the threat. And that takes a certain amount of energy. And as the further you go, the more fatigue you have, you end up having less and less energy. And that makes it harder to focus on your preferred view. But sometimes we just want to be objective and we want to say, well, what really is my safest option in each minute? And yet, there is no perfect objectivity because, again, our old pathways are such a big factor in how we weigh the alternatives.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So now I want to turn it to the question of design. And I'll tell you what my initial thought is. I will tell you the truth. For a long time, I've resisted looking at psychology when it comes to work. And that's partially because IO psychology has been very focused on productivity and what it takes to make productive people, as opposed to what it takes to create thriving people. But there's a second reason why I've resisted it. And the second reason is that I believe that if we are designing work, starting from psychology is farther away from actually being able to make design decisions than just asking somebody, what do you want from work? And the reason is that the underlying structure might be dopamine, let's say, the brain chemicals, but the specific thing that somebody is looking for that's going to trigger those emotions is going to be very, very different. And so what I like about this is that it helps me to categorize the responses a little bit, which is that some people are saying, well, I really want to feel like I'm in a group of people where I'm protected. And so I can recognize that no matter how they say it, they may say it 10 different ways, but it's still underlying that has the same root cause. But if I want to design something for somebody, I'm going to have to get more specific than the specific brain chemicals involved. I'm figuring this out as I go along. But traditionally, that's why I've been avoiding it. And there's a third reason I avoid it, which is that I don't know enough about it. And so I feel like it's a harder tool to pick up than design tools, which I do know a lot about. Here's what I guess I would say. It might not be a specific enough tool for me to design an experience for you, but it is a specific enough tool for you to work on modifying your own experience.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that, and possibly for a different reason. Because if you're an employer and you're asking people to look at their childhood experience and how it colors their present responses, people don't like that at all. They find it very offensive. And I remember when I was offended by, like the first 5 therapists that told me that I was creating this response. And then finally, I had to make the active choice to look at my own patterns. So a person has to has to want to look at that. If you try to push them into doing it, they're not going to be very happy with you. And so if the employer puts themselves in that position, I think it's a little dicey. And that's why, like, the way people respond to the person in authority in their workplace is so much shaped by their early experience. And yet no one is comfortable about admitting that or even discovering that inside themselves.
Yeah. And the history of IO Psych has been very much about, I'm going to study you, and it's about you being more productive. The path that we're taking on this show is work is the thing that should be the object of study. And it can be something that's external to the person doing the work that says, let's talk about this work experience and what you want from this product. It's a little bit less invasive. And so by talking about this product, which is not you, but this third thing, it can make it a little bit less invasive. Although I do know managers who are very involved in understanding for the people on their teams who are ready for it, understanding triggers and things like that. So you mentioned one way of sort of hacking one's own brain chemistry. So one way of hacking one's own brain chemistry is you find yourself in a situation that's producing cortisol. And you ask yourself, what are the childhood patterns that might have created that cortisol for me? And then you recognize that you're projecting this onto the world. What about the positive things? What do we look for and how do we enhance those?
Yeah, you just gave me an idea of how that could be done. So let's say that there's this work that needs to be done, and different individuals may respond to it in different ways. So an employer could present it as, okay, here's the work that needs to be done. If you want to approach it in a more dopamine stimulating way, here's a way to do that. If you want to approach it in a more oxytocin stimulating way, here's a way to do that. And I'm not saying that there is a type of person, because I'm more focused on, well, if I already have enough of this one in my life, I'm better off maybe helping myself to another. So a dopamine way of structuring work would be to organize it in smaller chunks where we're very conscious of the progress that we've made, and to structure rewards for each chunk. And to do it, as we all know, in ways that keep you accountable so that you actually make the progress and get the reward. And again, of course, the reward needs to be meaningful to the individual. Now, the oxytocin way of structuring it, again, would be a more group oriented task. And people would really need to understand the difference between the oxytocin way and the serotonin way. Because you could have a person who says they want a group, but really what they want is to tell everyone else in the group what to do, which is not really oxytocin at all. So, a healthy way to get serotonin out of it is to teach the task to another person, because that gets you to be in a one-up position, but still contributes to the productivity of the team. So,
That's super, super interesting. And the interviews that I've done have support this. So one of those things is midpoint milestones in projects. The project may take a year, but it may have milestones that happen monthly, and you can celebrate those milestones
yes.
and recognize them for what they are, as opposed to only celebrating at the very end of a project.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes it's a little spurious. I got this idea from someone I knew who would bicycle up a mountain, and he would tell me that he would divide the mountain in quarters and then celebrate when he reached each quarter. And I said to him, "What did you do to celebrate each quarter?" And he said, "Nothing." and and yet it really made him feel better.
No, I can see that. You don't have to sell it. You just have to know in your heart, I mean, one of the patterns for puzzle solvers is that if you look at the puzzles that people play for fun, they contain incremental wins. Like when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, it's got all the little pieces that go together one at a time. And ultimately, you get to the large things. Sudoku is the same. Crosswords are the same. You have these incremental wins that fuel the pursuit of the larger objective, and that are each individually fun or rewarding. And so I can definitely see that. I can see that in the breaking it down into smaller pieces. Group-oriented tasks is really interesting because that's a constant interplay. So now we're on oxytocin. It's a constant interplay between, am I getting closer to the center of the group as we do this group activity, or am I getting farther away from the center of the group as I do this group activity? And so how you can widen the circle so that more people feel included and part of the group. And that's an interesting design challenge.
I wouldn't necessarily call it more people feel included, because the person themselves has to feel included to stimulate their oxytocin. So if they're trying to control whether other people feel included, that's really like a social dominance thing, which is serotonin. And I say this because so many people are constantly finding fault and saying, well, I don't feel safe because of you and you and you and you. And nobody ever does anything good enough to make me feel safe. The simple famous example is that you want your spouse to wash the dishes, but then whenever they wash the dishes, they don't do it right. So it's really a skill within oneself to learn to feel safe rather than always finding fault with the support that you have.
That's a very, very good point. I also can see not that the person themselves is responsible for creating that safety, but that if a meeting facilitator might create situations in which people can find it. But you're right. This is a great example of how that experience is co-created,
Mm.
which is recognizing your part in the feelings that any situation is giving you. One of my instructors on facilitation once told me meeting space is ego space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's always a place where people are feeling that their status is okay or their status is threatened.
Yes. But in a way, is that by saying that you're threatened now, then you become the focus of attention. You get the power because everyone gives the power to whoever complains the most. So that's why it's such a challenge for facilitators.
So this is a point you made that I thought was super important, that status is very contextual. And so that feeling of being one up is in a context. And so depending upon the set that I'm going to decide is the set of people that are my peers, potentially, that's going to be what I use to determine whether I'm up or down. And so if I have a friend, he works for startups. And so he's always working with people who are very, very rich. And he always feels poor as a result. And that's just because he helps startups launch, but he doesn't necessarily profit from the launch.
Well, and also he's targeting the successful launches in his mind rather than the ones maybe that had to go back to waitressing or something.
Right, right. And he's an executive recruiter. And so the ones that are doing a lot of hiring are the successful ones. That's the ones he's always around. And also because he's an executive recruiter, he gets to see what everybody earns. And he gets to be in those negotiations. And it just makes him honestly feel pretty bad most of the time about his own status. And so who you expose yourself to as your peer group. And is the term referent something? This is something that I ran across in one of my other interviews, and I've never run across it again. A referent is somebody who you compare yourself to. And I don't know if that's a part of your work that you use the word referent.
I don't use that because to me, it's a thought loop. It's a neural pathway. And I'll give you an example. A famous example of what you're saying is a person who goes to the gym and then they're always looking at the person whose muscles are bigger and always putting themselves in a one down position. But another person may go to the gym and always say, wow, I'm so much better than I was yesterday and really feel satisfied with their own accomplishments. So the thought loop of always focusing on your weakness and the strength of others, you will keep reproducing that no matter what the referent is. You will just keep doing that. Now, let's take an opposite example. You go to the mall and you look at people who are not in as good shape as you are. So one person can feel good about that, although as cruel as it sounds, but people do that. But another person can have this like fear reaction, like, oh my God, if I eat the slightest bit of extra piece of cheese, that I'm going to look like that. So it's this constant fear of the slightest thing will lose all of my status and I'll be back in the depths. So that's a learned pattern. And we can find that in our childhood and rewire it because otherwise we just keep repeating it.
One psychological pattern that we've talked about on the show is narcissism. Does it have a different set of rewards to people who follow that pattern? Are they responding to a different landscape of brain chemicals?
Well, I would say a different landscape of neural pathways, which are the expectations about what will trigger the chemical. So I use the example like in the animal world, a little dog is not going to bark at a big dog because it will get bitten, and pain then wires it to anticipate the pain and to restrain itself. But in the human world, you see like a little poodle barks at a big dog, and the little poodle just gets hugs and kisses and no negative reinforcement. So the little dog learns that it's safe and rewarded to bark at other dogs a lot. So it's all learned.
Yeah. And I can certainly see a pattern of attention for negative behaviors establishing itself as a pattern that people reproduce in adulthood. That makes a lot of sense. We use the term embodiment to describe the physical part of cognition and the physical part of emotion. When we say that, are we talking about these brain chemicals? And I guess I have a question about that, which is that the brain chemicals, it may be that the brain blood barrier is not permeable, but when I feel shame, I blush or I sweat or my whole body responds to it. And so, what's the relationship there? Is that chemicals are being released to my whole body, or is it that neurological signals are being released to my whole body?
Well, I think all of these chemicals do have bodily effects. That's their job. So the simple example I use, like with dopamine, again, it's designed to release your reserve tank of energy. It says, this reward is worth your investment of energy. And so you may as well invest it. And this is like a lion deciding which gazelle to run after. And if it fails in too many chases, then its tank of energy is empty and it's going to starve. So it has to make careful decisions about when to release its energy. So when you say, I can get this one, that thought goes with a physical release of energy. Now, I found it fascinating. The guy who invented the term fight or flight, he was at Harvard Medical School 100 years ago, Walter Cannon, and he discovered that the impact of cortisol on animals, it affected every system, like the reproductive system, the immune system, digestive, respiratory. And he said, why would one chemical affect all these different systems? And then he saw that it was the context, the survival situation that required that whole array of physiological responses. So that's what I think of as each of the happy chemicals. It's not that they have one specific physical response, but their very job is in a situation where a variety of physiological responses is useful.
It seems like the good feeling brain chemicals have a short half life and we can exhaust our resources there. But it seems like cortisol may not have the same limitation.
Yeah. Yeah. Cortisol lasts longer, and it's also rather easy to get into a cortisol spiral. And what that means is once I have the bad feeling, it's nature's alert. And when a gazelle feels cortisol, it doesn't just run, because first it has to take in information to find out where the predator is. So when I feel the bad feeling of cortisol, I take in information, but I'm only looking for bad information. So then I look around and I find bad information because I'm so skillful with my big cortex. And that triggers more cortisol, which triggers more scanning for bad information and leads to the cortisol spiral that people know so well.
Wow, that's fascinating. And we had Christina Maslock on the show, who did a lot of the definitions of burnout. The way she describes burnout is it's like cortisol exhaustion, essentially. She didn't say it that way, but that it's this constant onslaught of cortisol, and then pretty soon people just can't function.
I hear people call it adrenal fatigue. That's like what yoga
Maybe.
teachers
I
call
haven't
it.
heard that term, adrenal fatigue. I mean, the things that were causing burnout in that particular case, I wish I could had them on the tip of my tongue, but they did have to do with constant status threats. Well, that seemed to be one of the biggest ones. And threats to safety. So, constant threats to safety, constant. And a lot of what her work was on people in the medical industry. So, nurses who are in a situation, very high pressure, not necessarily high status, a lot of things that were leaning on them at the same time. What I want to do is I want to start thinking about how this incorporates into everything else. But one of the things it does for me in terms of this conversation is it says it says some of the fundamental systemic structures upon which people build their work experience. And so knowing that that's the underlying thing, I may not be able to design around it all the time, but sometimes I can recognize it. I can even go through a checklist. Am I taking care of the dopamine? Am I taking care? Like, it may be different for different people, but I can actually go through and say, am I really considering this? And can potentially create situations in which each one of those things is considered. I do think that that's a powerful tool. It's not necessarily predictive, but it is something that can be used as a tool for making sure that everything is thought through, which I find very powerful. So I ask a question at the end of every show, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? So your work hires you to do something for it, or your clients do, or something else. What do you hire your work to do for you?
So I've given a lot of thought to this because I'm formally retired in the sense that I have my pension. So I'm focused on like, what do I want to do? And I just do what feels good. And then I look for the pattern, like what is it feels good for me? And I decided is the experience of telling the truth, which means saying what I actually think rather than the lifetime of my experience where I could never say what I actually thought. So for reasonable constraints, in the workplace, you have to be very careful about what you say. And then when I was a child, I could easily get slapped in the face if I said the wrong thing, which very deeply wired that, anticipation. And so for me, it's very big reward to get to say what I think rather than what I feel is expected.
I want to tie that back into brain chemicals. How would you say that in your own, approach?
I think that not being able to say what I think was very, very one down position for me. So being able to say what I think is like the ultimate one up position for me, more than any other kind of money, recognition, whatever. And the way I think about it, I use the example of, let's say I was a lawyer who was earning some X amount per hour, and I would not want that job for anything because that lawyer can never say what they think. They have to just say what is going to be needed and required and expected at every minute. And is almost never free to have their own thoughts. So this is a very individual thing. And they define the one up position in their way. And we all get to look at our own circuits and figure out how we define it.
Yeah, I hire my job to tell the truth. That's a response I've never heard before. I would not have necessarily thought of that as a status question, as a one-up question, but it makes total sense to me that being controlled externally in any way is automatically a one-down position.
Yes, although having said that, everyone is controlled in some way or another. So, like when you were saying about the nurses, so I was thinking, well, although nurses may perceive themselves as powerless and unsafe, that a doctor could get one complaint and it can ruin his career and then he can't pay back his loans. So everyone has some kind of potential threats in their lives. It's just which ones weigh most heavily on us depends on our own pathways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about how I run teams, and I recommend others run teams, is I recommend flipping the org chart so that the managers below is a support and above is the branches of the organization. And so what that means is that being promoted is actually being demoted down the tree, which is that you're in a situation where you are supporting more people. Now, the team feels good about this and bad about this. On the one hand, the one down position of being managed and micromanaged is very definitely has a one down position that people don't like. On the other hand, there's an exposure to being free to make all your own decisions. And so there can also be a response, which is, I'd like a little more structure. I'd like a little more safety. I'd like a little more, tell me what to do. So again, this is an example of how different people respond differently, and there might be competing needs.
Yeah, and it's very, very individual. So I'll give you my personal example. So I grew up in a rather uneducated family. So there was very little expectation there's little pressure to excel academically or in any other way. So anything I did for myself. So I never did it to please others. So I always relied on my own, like what I think is right, what I think is desirable. But if I were just doing it to please others, and if I had been rewarded for that and I had learned that, then I would really want more guidance from others, like, how can I please you? But for me, that's not the coin of the realm because there was nothing I could do to please anybody. So I learned at a young age to just please myself. So that's what I mean by it's very individual.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. How can people learn more about you and your work?
Thank you. So my website is innermammalinstitute.org, innermammalinstitute.org. And I have a 5-day happy chemical jumpstart where you get one email a day for 5 days that explains each of the chemicals if you opt in, and then you get on the newsletter list, and it has information about all of my books, and I have lots of videos, podcasts, infographics, all the information you want to understand your happy chemicals.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Sure. Thank you so much for the great questions. It was very interesting.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.